So welcome everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you all here. As you know, this is the inaugural Life as a Clinician-Scientist seminar. Well, we had to make it a webinar for all the reasons that you know, but it's the first one specifically for allied health. But I'd like to begin first by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the many lands all around Australia from which we're meeting today. I acknowledge the Gadigal people because it's from their lands that I'm joining today. The Indigenous peoples of Australia were the nation's first scientists, and they remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their lands. And I pay respects to the elders past and present and acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. So today we're aiming to provide you all with the opportunity to learn more about research embedded in healthcare delivery, particularly to benefit your patients, how to do the research, what such a career looks like for allied health, how to make it happen in your workplace, and how to make research sustainable in the daily life of a clinician. That's a bit of a tall order, but that's the aim. So to do this, we've chosen presenters who represent all the different career stages. So they'll share their stories, not the sanitized version, but the real version, those exhilarating highs, which I hope they are, and I guess some of the painful barriers. But I'm really pleased to note that from what I saw as a total desert in relation to clinician-scientist positions for allied health, that there are now quite a few opportunities arising in all sorts of organisations. So I think if we harness our energy, I'm pretty sure we'll be able to build on that and create a pathway for us. So how we've organised it is to have four speakers from the very beginning of their clinician-scientist career, right through to very senior fellows. And together, they'll be able to give you a sense of the full career life cycle. And we've also got two other very senior presenters who I've just loosely nominated panellists, but they will be presented, Gráinne O'Loughlin and Nadine Foster, because they bring a different perspective so that to help you think big. So even if you start small, you can think big. All these speakers will share their stories and how they created opportunities to embed research in their clinical work. So this webinar is primarily a showcase about how allied health professionals have taken these opportunities, exploring both the exciting and difficult aspects of the path and inviting plenty of questions and ideas from all of you, from the participants. It also gives us a chance, I hope, to seek your input into how to make these opportunities more available in your workplace. So we've got a Q&A through the panel session because the session is all about you. So please make the absolute most of it. Ask any question you want to. No question is too small, and definitely no question is too stupid. Just be absolutely sure other people would want to know the answer. And if we can't get through all the questions, then we'll harness that energy and work out how to take it forward and how to respond to all those unanswered questions. But before handing you to Ingrid Scheffer, I want to acknowledge my wonderful organising committee. So I've got Professor Kim Bennell from the University of Melbourne. We've got Professor Kathy Sherrington from the University of Sydney. And I also want to introduce you to Anne-Marie Boxall, who's our Federal Chief Allied Health Officer. She generously changed her schedule completely to be able to attend today. And I think it's her that might actually help us move this path forward. And I'd like to also thank our sponsor, the University of Sydney. And of course, the Academy. The Academy is hosting this session, and thank you, T and Steve and all the others. But I particularly extend a heartfelt thank you to Professor Ingrid Scheffer, President of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences. It is 100% because of her that the session is happening today. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Ingrid. So in addition to being our president, Laureate Professor Ingrid Scheffer, AO, is a physician scientist. I have to read this, this is long. A physician scientist whose work has changed the lives of children with epilepsy. She's chair of paediatric neurology at the University of Melbourne, director of paediatrics at Austin Health, co-director of its Epilepsy Research Centre. She's also an honorary research fellow at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, honorary senior principal research fellow at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, and also she runs a private paediatric clinic. And she's an unbelievable woman. So when I invited her to join us to welcome you and say a few words today about the Academy, I actually thought I was being a bit bold. She holds so many positions, including at the Academy, that I just couldn't imagine that she'd agree, but I thought I'd try anyway. But she literally jumped out of the phone with enthusiasm and excitement. She's such a huge supporter of what we do in allied health and such a wonderful person. So Ingrid.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm really delighted to warmly thank everyone for coming today to the Life as a Clinician-Scientist for Allied Health. I'd also like to acknowledge the lands I'm on, which are those of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, this is a huge milestone for the Academy, our very first Life as a Clinician-Scientist symposium dedicated to the allied health professions. And it's great that we have over 130 people joining us online today. For those of you unfamiliar with the Academy, we are Australia's learned academy for the health and medical sciences, and we're the newest of Australia's 5 learned academies. We are an expert body of 425 fellows who are the leaders in health and medical research and innovation in Australia, and we provide an independent voice for the broader health and medical sciences sector. One of the 4 missions of the Academy is to nurture the next generation of leaders in the health. When the Academy developed a flagship mentorship program for outstanding mid-career researchers, such as Professor Morgan, who we'll hear from later today, of our flagship program. And when I was setting up the mentorship program, my son, who was at the time a final year medical student, challenged me and said, Mum, you've got to get them much younger than this. You've got to get the students to think about the fantastic opportunities that careers as a clinician scientist afford. So then Life as a Clinician Scientist, the best of both worlds, was born. And it's been occurring every year since, which is now 6 years, and it's been targeted to the medical profession. But I always envisaged that this program would embrace all types of clinician scientists. We needed to get a critical mass of stellar clinician scientists in allied health to lead the way. And here I thank Kathy and her organising committee for achieving this. The aim today is to inspire you to consider such a truly extraordinary career. We don't have one career in a day, we have 4. And our outcomes are life-changing for our patients, but also for the wider community. After 20 years in a profession, we are not bored, we're excited to get up and affect change. Today, you'll hear from outstanding researchers about how they got to where they are today, how they fell in love with research, and how it makes you a better practitioner. And I hope this will be the beginning, the first of many allied health Life as a Clinician Scientist symposia. I now hand back to Kathy to begin our official program for the afternoon. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. That was lovely. We had little tiny internet things, but it was fabulous. Thank you so much. So now I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Janine Mattis. who's a senior occupational therapist at the Fiona Stanley Fremantle Hospitals Group. She works in a clinical role in Perth, although she's currently on parental leave. She's come off leave to speak to you today. Pretty awesome. She has some research experience, having completed several workplace-based projects, and she's already published 5 first author peer-reviewed articles, even though she's just planning to enroll in a PhD soon. And she's now contemplating how best to forge a career path towards being a clinician researcher. I'm sure she'll have plenty of tips for those of you thinking about starting on this path. So Janine is speaking about, as you can see, when I grow up, a journey towards clinicians. Thanks, Janine.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this really exciting event. So today I'll share some reflections about my first steps towards that journey of becoming a clinician researcher. And hold on, sorry. So, hang on. So my interest in doing research started back in my undergrad days through doing honours and various research assistant work. And then when I started working as a clinician in 2011, I thought I'd go on pretty much straight away to do more research. But I found that those early years for me quickly filled up with learning the day-to-day ropes of working as an OT in a busy hospital setting. And during that time also, I wasn't ready to enroll in a master's or PhD, but instead I was on the lookout for opportunities to get involved in doing research projects that were embedded in my workplace. So then in 2016, this fabulous opportunity came up to design and lead a study evaluating a new service that we had set up in the OT department. And I was extremely fortunate at the time to receive a bit of internal clinical backfill funding from OT and allied health research departments, which allowed me to go offline 1 day a week for a few months. And I was also really grateful to receive some excellent mentoring from the then Professor of Allied Health, Sharon Micken, and research fellows. And they really guided me through that whole process from developing my research protocol all the way through to publication. And I'm forever grateful for their patience and kindness because there was so much to learn, but it was also really exciting. And then that really was a springboard to a couple of years later when then I was fortunate enough to be seconded as an allied health research project officer. And again, working alongside Sharon, Micken and the research fellows, I got to lead a couple of interesting projects, really interesting actually, including an evaluation of research capacity and culture amongst allied health in Gold Coast Health, and doing a systematic review of frameworks for research capacity building. And through that, for capacity building amongst allied health, working in tertiary and secondary healthcare organisations. And from this, we identified 3 themes for research capacity building and 17 sub-themes. And we use those to then build a new toolkit of strategies with a really practical focus for clinicians and managers, all about building people's skills and confidence to engage in research. And so managed from those projects to have a handful of peer-reviewed journal articles, which is super exciting. But then soon after finishing that project, where I moved to Western Australia in 2018, and went back into full-time clinical roles within the South Metropolitan Health Service here in WA Health. Although admittedly it would take quite a few more months of unpaid work on evenings and weekends to get all of those articles written up and published. But going back to clinical work after being immersed in research was very rewarding, and I was pleasantly surprised that I noticed quite a few positive changes in the way I practiced. So for example, I found myself being more systematic in the way I approach goal setting and treatment planning, and really strategically step by step working backwards from my goals and being really clear about what we were trying to achieve, probably more so even than before. More consistently using outcome measures to track change amongst my clients, and not to mention better skilled at finding, critically appraising and translating research into practice. But then in 2020, I was again fortunate enough to be seconded 1 day a week to South Metro Allied Health Research, working alongside our Allied Health Research Director, Ben Cavalieri, to run a similar evaluation of allied health research capacity and culture amongst allied health here, as what I'd done on the Gold Coast. And we also published those findings just recently. Soon after finishing the project, I then went on maternity leave and been very busy training my research assistant. And this is him helping me prepare for a recent conference presentation. And I've also been successful in getting a full-time funded PhD scholarship, jointly funded between South Metro Health Service and Curtin University, but I've not yet started that while I've been on leave. And so I thought what I'd do now is share a bit about what has helped me in this journey so far to get involved in research and make the most of those opportunities, as well as some things that I feel would be helpful, both for me and perhaps others in a similar stage of their career. So for me, it's firstly all about having had access to opportunities to get involved, and that I think is partly seeking them out, but also partly being fortunate to have opportunities come my way. But for me, starting small and learning by doing has been absolutely essential. I think doing research is a lot like learning a language. You can go to classes and do things in abstract, but until you actually live the language and do the work, I think it's hard to consolidate those skills. Doing projects which were relevant to practice, clearly embedded in what I was already doing my day-to-day, and that I could see the outcomes of being able to be implemented back into practice was very motivating and much easier to do. Having access to some protected time and funding, including in-kind funding from within the department and some secondments within the organisation. Really important was having managers who valued, encouraged and rewarded research, and in really tangible ways, so that allowing me to do research within work time, even though I admit that there was time spent outside of work. Definitely some of that I was supported to do within work time, and including things like including research as standard agenda items in departmental meetings to keep it really relevant and important. Having access to support and mentoring, which was really hands-on, tailored and ongoing through the whole process, but especially important at the beginning when I was first establishing project plans and developing protocols, and at the end when it came to writing for publication. If I hadn't had that great support in those phases, I'm not sure that I would be having 5 publications under my name so far. Seeking out and building a community of other researchers around me, particularly peers at a similar stage of the research journey, and having access to that real just-in-time education of what to do, how to do it, and why it's important, which helped build my attitudes and values around research. So again, I think having access to lots of webinars and things is excellent, but especially useful so when talking about specific research skills when it's at the time when you need it. And having the opportunity to implement findings back into practice was also very motivating. And all these strategies are also consistent with the findings of our systematic review about research capacity building. Other things that would have been helpful include opportunities to get involved earlier, perhaps, while working as a clinician. So having more access to small projects or team-based projects that perhaps someone else is leading, and that I could have assisted with, say, doing some data collection, or even just to be involved in without having to take on the responsibility of leading a whole project. Having protected time for research built into clinical leadership and management positions to reflect those 3 levels of research engagement that people often talk about, which is that all clinicians should be using research evidence to inform practice, some participating in research and a few leading research projects. Having more partnerships with other health services, universities, and also interdisciplinary to be sharing ideas, exchanging mentoring and resources. More funding, of course, including matched funding from other sectors, and better research efficiency. So I've got this bit of a mantra: love, knowledge, hate waste. I'd love it if it was easier for everyone to be able to access and implement existing research, like having more evidence-informed clinical guidelines, synthesising existing evidence, and so that we can clearly see where the gaps are and hone in on them, and having research registers to prioritise important research questions and ideally coordinate between different sites and organisations. And also more streamlined processes. I'm sure everyone thinks this, for ethics and governance and publication. And so from here, next steps. So as I'm planning my PhD, I'm really excited and thoroughly convinced of the benefits of doing research, both from my personal experience so far, as well as through the projects that I've been involved in, looking at research capacity building and allied health. So to name a few, for me personally, things have been like the benefits have included feeding my hunger for learning and achieving new and different things, better outcomes for patients, and showing that what we do makes a difference and helps keep building the credibility and relevance of, in my case, occupational therapy as a profession into the future. At the same time, though, I go in and out of struggling a little bit to sometimes weigh up these benefits against the big commitment and sacrifices that doing a PhD involves, especially at this stage in my life when I'm a new mum. And while I love research, I don't want to give up clinical work, and I'm really looking for ways to combine the two, both now and into the future. And I personally am extremely lucky to work in an incredibly supportive department where my manager is actually willing to let me keep my substantive while I do my PhD, which is amazing. But also looking long term, I'd ideally like to have a bit more certainty about what my career options would look like post PhD. Or whether there'll be options to get into roles within health services that have some dedicated time for doing and leading research. And I know the literature says we need lots of strategies to build research capacity to support clinicians who want to be research participants and leaders. I think it is so important to look at strengthening motivators and enablers as much as mitigating barriers. And I also know it's not just about supporting individual clinicians, but putting in place the right support and commitment from all levels of leadership and management and policymakers. And so with all this weighing on my mind, I'm really looking forward to learning from our other panelists about how they forged their careers, maintained their motivation, and overcame some of those challenges. So thank you.
Janine, thank you so much. What a beautiful way to set up the session. And yeah, hopefully there'll be some ideas coming out from some of the other panelists. And so I think that your questions will be the same that many other of our registrants have as well. So now I'm delighted to invite Dr. Bernadette Brady to speak. She's a musculoskeletal and pain physiotherapist. She's a in Southwest Sydney Local Health District at Liverpool Hospital, and she was awarded a Sphere Clinical Research Fellowship. Sphere is an academic health research translation centre. She completed her PhD on novel culturally responsive approaches to pain management, for which she received a prestigious New South Wales Health Award. The Sphere Fellowship, together with the academic affiliations with Sydney and Western Sydney universities, enables Bernadette to continue her research to improve outcomes for culturally and linguistically diverse communities with musculoskeletal pain conditions and chronic disease. And Bernadette will be talking about navigating the early years as a clinician-scientist, and I'm a bit concerned about her first slide. So thank you, Bernadette.
Thanks. So thank you for inviting me to come along and join the session today. I'm really excited to hear from all the panelists, and hopefully you can find something useful from my talk. So I want to just begin by saying that it's only really recently that I've started to consider myself to be a clinician researcher. and that up until the last 18 months, I really only thought of myself as a clinician who was learning to do research or trying to do research. So today I'm just going to share with you a little bit about that journey and some of the lessons that I've learned that have helped me navigate that transition. So like many of you who are joining the session today, I started my career as a clinician, and I thought I had my journey fairly mapped out. I'd finished my physiotherapy training, so surely I now had the tools to achieve my intended pathway and my goals. And as cliche as that sounds, it was to help people and improve patient outcomes. But achieving these goals or navigating this pathway was a little bit more convoluted than I'd intended. And it sent me in different directions, and it's required that I learn different skills or acquire different skills in order to achieve this. So if I take myself back to the beginning of the journey, I started physiotherapy in 2006, and a few years into clinical practice, I started noticing that things weren't going according to plan. Some patients were getting better and others weren't, and this was frustrating. Now, at the time, I just assumed it's because I needed to be a better clinician, and that if I built more knowledge and refined my skills, then I would be able to improve everyone. And so this set me in a direction to do a master's degree, a clinical master's, not a research one. And while the master's was fantastic, it taught me a lot, and it certainly made me a better clinician, it didn't quite resolve the problem. As I continued working, the frustrations were still there. Some of my patients were getting better and others weren't. And so once again, I just assumed that perhaps if I broadened my horizons, if I again went back to the drawing board, learnt more, became a better clinician, then I would be able to help everyone. And so I moved around. I worked in public and private settings. I went into some specialty clinics and worked with multidisciplinary teams. And this was a fantastic experience. It taught me a lot about being a physiotherapist. It made me more holistic in my approach, but it didn't quite settle that discontentment. I still remain frustrated that I wasn't reaching certain people. I wasn't achieving what I'd intended to. And so this really marks a bit of a turning point in my career. I started to reflect a lot more to see if I could really articulate what was this discontentment. Could I define exactly what the problem was? And so I started collecting some data, just as part of my clinical practice, having a look a little bit more specifically and seeing if I could articulate what that problem was. What was I unhappy with? Who wasn't I getting better? And I started to notice some patterns. About 2/3 of the patients that I was working with were from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. They spoke Assyrian, Arabic, and Vietnamese. And when I looked closer at the outcomes that I was noticing, by and large, it was outcomes from these communities that I was most challenged by. A lot of these patients weren't getting better. They weren't engaging as much in treatment as they could. And then I started to realize how little I actually understood about how health and how pain was experienced by people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and especially these communities who had now been working with close to some 8 to 10 years. All the training I'd done to date hadn't really made me consider that culture played a major role. And when I looked to the evidence, it couldn't really guide me either. And so this began my research career. Now, when I began and enrolled in my PhD in 2015, I had absolutely no idea where I was headed, but I knew 2 things. I knew, number one, that I wanted to build the research around my clinical practice. Not only did I think that doing data collection as part of my work would help me juggle the role of a full-time clinician with a part-time research student, but also because I thought it would help make sure my research remained clinically relevant. The second thing I knew was that having now articulated the challenge for me, or the problem that I was facing, I knew that I wanted my research to focus on working with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, to try to understand their perspective of health and illness, and particularly pain, because that's my area of interest, and see if I could apply things, adapt things, develop things that could improve their outcomes. But beyond that, I had no idea where I was headed or what I was going to do. I especially had no idea how I was going to achieve it. I mean, I don't speak a language other than English, and I don't identify with any other cultures. And here I was about to embark on a research direction that required both of those things. But I think the thing that put me in the greatest stead was that I did it anyway. I had no money for translations or interpreters, and so I just found solutions. I built networks and I started negotiating with people. I negotiated in particular with Multicultural Health Unit, and in return for some of their assistance with some of my early project work, I went out and did health promotion talks and community activities with them so that it was a reciprocal relationship. And what I realized was that by starting, it actually fueled momentum, and then momentum brought success. I could use some of the preliminary data to help secure small pockets of funds. So $3,000 or $4,000 to help pay for some of those research costs, interpreters, translations. And with that money and one study under my belt, I was able to apply for a slightly larger grant to do a pilot randomized control trial. And again, with that project, it started to build success. And gradually, I was climbing the staircase from there. So my biggest advice here is that you don't have to have it all mapped out to begin, but taking a first step, you can find solutions along the path. So having made the decision to get started with research and pursue a topic of great clinical interest, I had to navigate a team. I wanted a team that would support me to design the research around my clinical caseload and allow me as best possible to work full-time when I began. And building the team was perhaps one of the greatest challenges that I faced. I decided to work with someone who had a completely different perspective to me. And this came in the form of one of my PhD supervisors who was a sociologist. And I found this initially incredibly challenging. At times it felt like we were speaking a different language. And what I didn't realize was that as an established clinician now, I'd actually spent most of my time with people who thought the same as I did, who had the same perspective of health and illness, who had also undergone the same types of training that I had. And so as I started to work and develop a new appreciation of different perspectives, I also started to do things differently. Not only was this fundamental for the sort of research that I was doing, which was cross-cultural research, working with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, but it helped make me a better clinician. I started having conversations with patients that I never would have had when I first began. And here is where I started to notice those early frustrations were easing and my patient outcomes were improving. So my advice here would be to look for those people who can challenge your perspective. Get varied opinions on clinical problems and not just those within your own profession or within the health sector, because sometimes the insights of others may help to clarify the direction you want to go. So now, having progressed through my PhD, I started to believe in myself. And not in an arrogant sort of way, but in a way that makes you say yes to lots of things, to every opportunity. So new opportunities, grant applications, supervising students, and I'm sure many of the more experienced researchers can talk to this better. But it wasn't long before I started to feel overwhelmed. And so the challenge here was really to try and prioritize and find out what was most important to me. What was my why for doing this in the first place? And what was my motivation for continuing this? And to let that be my guide and my direction as I started to make some really difficult decisions around clinical practice, academia, doing a postdoc, etc. And by staying true to my why and not jumping at the first attractive offer, I've now been successful in securing a clinical research fellowship that supports me to blend both in my clinical workplace. So if I was to summarize some of the key lessons that I've learned along my journey, I would say 3 things. So not to wait till the right time or the grant to be successful or to even enroll in a degree. Start looking at your caseload, start looking at what you can collect, and sometimes you get great ideas and great direction from there. To seek perspectives on clinical challenges that are different to your own, and to let your why, find your why and let that shape of the many wonderful things you could do, what things will most fulfill you. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bernie. I'm learning so much from you guys. I think they're lessons I should have known a long time ago, but that's excellent advice and fantastic tips. So now, getting a bit further along the career path, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Gavin Williams, who's Professor of Physiotherapy Rehabilitation, which is a joint role working 50% with Epworth Healthcare in neurological rehab and 50% with the University of Melbourne. He's a specialist that's a fellow of the Australian College of Physiotherapists and has worked in neurological rehabilitation for 30 years. From all his work there, he's now a world leader in the assessment, classification and treatment of mobility limitations following traumatic brain injury, and was involved in developing a new classification system for Paralympic athletes, which was implemented at the London Paralympics. And so, as you can imagine, he's an extremely popular speaker, invited to lots of seminars and conferences. So we're very lucky to secure him to speak with you today. And he will be talking about juggling the demands of a clinician-scientist role. So thank you, Gavin.
Oh, thanks, Kathy, and for those kind words and the invitation, an honour really to present and this great initiative. So. My background is, as a physio, I work primarily in brain injury rehab and a wider field of neurological rehab. And when I started in at this hospital where I currently work, over 25 years ago now, we had this emerging research culture. And this is the thing, I suppose, that drives me is people with severe brain injuries that we treat, and really trying to work out what is the nature and extent of the brain injury. What are the best treatments? How do we optimize these people's outcomes? How do we reduce residual disability? And so we see, considerable change over time, but, how do we, best achieve that, most efficiently achieve that? So I really had no, motivation to do research or a PhD. But I suppose what kicked me off on my journey was, we had this clinical problem that I wanted to resolve, and really the structure of the doctoral process was really the only way forward. And years down the track now, I work in this joint role between the university and the hospital, which I'll explain. So I graduated in the end of '91, and just worked and travelled as some physios do for a number of years, and then came home and did a grad dip in health research methods that I finished in '98, which was the first dipping of a toe in the water for research, and then had a year off and then started a PhD part-time. So over this 5-year period, I actually worked full-time whilst doing the PhD, and managed to squeeze in buying a house and starting a family and all those things I would not recommend to anyone else, but I wouldn't change a thing. So after I finished my PhD the following year, I got a grant and then a series of fellowships I was lucky to receive. And, so for about 10 years, I, started down this pathway of combining clinical work and clinical research. So it kept my clinical work going until about 5 years ago, it became formally a joint position between the hospital and the university, which is, 0.5 and 0.5. So honestly, I probably never really had a plan or a vision or, 5-year plan, and, until more recently. So, for these last 16 years, I have managed to juggle generally about 0.5 and 0.5 clinical work and clinical research, bounce along from one thing to the other, but always in, the field of neurological rehab. Clinically, I still have a caseload. I still go to ward rounds and family meetings and all those usual clinical things. And then research-wise, I have an amazing group of colleagues I work with, and a team of 8 or 9 PhD students who all strongly identify as clinicians, and will hopefully become the next generation of clinician scientists. So in terms of the things I've learned about myself, I suppose, is that for me as a clinician scientist, the interface is where it's at. So for me, I find that with my clinical hat on, I have better informed research questions, not necessarily better designed research questions, because that's up for the wider team. But it helps me work out things that I think might make a difference. And then at the other end of the pipeline, maybe better positioned to assist with the knowledge transfer and implementation, because you know, you get your first publication, it's wonderful, and it's exciting, and then you realise it's actually not about publications, because you know, you simply just can't publish your research and expect, you know, the world to change. So it just doesn't work that way, and it's hard to change behaviour of our patients. It's hard to change the behaviour of our clinicians and get them to do, you know, new and different things, or get them to stop doing things that maybe don't work. So, you know, that's, you know, one of the key roles I think of a clinician scientist is, you know, to lead that change and be a role model for, you know, this emerging career pathway, which, you know, hasn't really existed, you know, a generation ago. So, you know, as Janine and Bernadette have touched on, you know, like, it's really important to ask, connect, collaborate, find mentors. I've been exceptionally lucky to have been at the receiving end of a lot of advice and assistance from, you know, very senior colleagues. It's very humbling how generous people are of their time. And, you know, it's probably a lesson I learned off Julie Bernhardt many years ago. Just be generous with your time, and it's, you know, never cease to be amazed at the emails you receive, you know, at all hours of the night from people who are, you know, just happy to volunteer their time to help you out. So, you know, it's really important to make the time to, you know, encourage and guide the next generation of clinician scientists. And hopefully maybe we can help stop hemorrhaging some of our best clinicians from, you know, going down the management pathway or teaching or other industries. But in this, you know, dual role, there's, you know, many pros and cons. I suppose the most important thing is it's endlessly rewarding. It's, you know, it's fantastic work. One of the biggest cons is, you know, it's the dumb stuff that really gets to you, like, you know, having to do 2 lots of mandatory training and having to go to a annual, you know, appraisal, and, you know, you want to discuss to the extent to which you're changing the world, and you're getting appraised on is your mandatory training up to date. But it's endlessly rewarding. There's no doubt that a PhD is hard and it's a steep learning curve, but, you know, you surround yourself with supervisors and mentors that will help you along the path, and it's endlessly rewarding. But if you thought a PhD was hard, postdoctoral life is, you know, probably harder. It's, you know, very challenging to get fellowships and grants, you know, to keep that aspect of your career going, but it's endlessly rewarding. So the career pathway really is in its infancy, but it's changing. So I suppose the most important thing is, if you are a clinician thinking about research or a potential career as a clinician scientist, it is a leap of faith. Like, the first step is initially quite stressful, but slowly, step by step, you get there. And then when you look back, you sort of realise it wasn't so bad after all. So as Bernadette said, just do it. You know, do it well, do it properly, but just do it. Take the first step and get started. And, you know, you do it because you love it. It's endlessly stimulating and rewarding. And as a clinician scientist, and, you know, being the supervisor of a lot of PhD students who all strongly identify as clinicians, you know, you sort of get to have the best of both worlds. So as a clinician, you still get that, you know, get to have that individual impact and that reward of you know, treating a patient. But then with your scientist hat on, you also get to do, you know, or potentially have a much greater impact nationally or internationally, you know, with the research you're doing. You get to place your eggs in many baskets, and at times you feel like you're getting pulled in different directions. And there is no doubt you need to be resilient and have the hide of a rhino. You know, grants and fellowships are hard to come by, and you know, my own personal experience in the last 2 or 3 years is that I've been very close and basically failed. And in obtaining a grant or a fellowship, and maybe that's not fair, and maybe I just need to be better, but I certainly don't have any trouble getting out of bed in the morning, because I work with, you know, some pretty you know, amazing and inspiring people. But things are, you know, changing for the better, and, you know, that might be glacial, but, you know, a generation ago there probably wasn't really a career pathway for a clinician scientist. But there are opportunities in Victoria in the public health system. We have these grade 4 allied health research translation roles, which are, you know, a great initiative. I happen to work in a private hospital, so I've actually had to spend a bit of time to educate the hierarchy as to the importance of clinical research and clinicians that are involved in research. And there's lots of evidence that research active hospitals have better patient outcomes because of the culture it creates. So there's lots of benefits to getting involved in this role. I'm also a member of a group of Australian allied health professors who are in conjoint positions. So they're similar to me in that they are researchers embedded in healthcare networks and have this dual role. And they recently released their position statement, which had a few aims, one of which was to raise the profile of allied health research because of the significant contribution it makes to the Australian healthcare system, but also as a call to develop and the training and career paths for allied health researchers. In my specialty of physio, we have the Australian College of Physio that acknowledges people that make a significant contribution too. So there are rewards that aren't available in just in that clinician role. But I suppose my last point is that all clinicians are or should be clinician-scientists. Clinical life is that continual N=1 single case design where you assess someone, you problem solve, you develop an aim hypothesis, what's wrong, you intervene and you reassess. That's not dissimilar to the research process where you're just simply doing it in bigger, larger groups. So they're very, very similar, and I think it's just a natural transition for many clinicians with that interest. Just to transition into that role of a clinician scientist. And thanks very much for the invitation to speak. Cheers.
Oh, thank you, Gavin. And it's endlessly rewarding, except for that really scary video that you showed. But thank you very, very much, seeing the pinnacle when you really get there. I'm noticing that there's questions coming through on Slido. We'll get to them when we finish, but I also noticed people have joined from the UK, so you're very welcome. And Anne-Marie Boxall is also online, and I don't know if they managed to show her, but I'm now pleased to introduce Professor Angela Morgan, who is an NHMRC Elizabeth Blackburn Fellow. That means she was the top, listen to this, she was the top female NHMRC fellowship applicant, and she's also an NHMRC Investigator Grant Fellow. She leads the Speech and Language Group at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and is also Professor of Speech Pathology and a Dame Kate Campbell Professorial Fellow at the University of Melbourne. She leads the NHMRC Centre of Research Excellence in Speech and Language Neurobiology, which focuses on identifying gene pathways associated with child speech disorders. This is really pioneering work. When she started in the mid-90s, there was little to no evidence that speech disorders can have any genetic cause. She's also co-director of the Speech Genomics Clinic at the Royal Children's Hospital, Melbourne. So lots of juggling there. This is the first clinic of its kind internationally. So thank you, Angela.
Thanks so much, Kathy. And again, thanks for the invitation to join this really wonderful forum this afternoon. Well, my first exposure to speech pathology and also really to hypothesis testing was as a little 6-year-old when I toddled along to this clinic in my hometown to see my brother have therapy for his mild speech disorder. And I started hypothesis testing because I thought, oh yeah, good luck, lady. I don't know that you'll be able to fix my little brother because my dad has a similar problem and my grandpa too. Well, wonderful Lynn Brooks did fix my brother's speech disorder. So I got to see speech therapy in action and also early intervention. I then went along to high school and we had a deaf unit, as it was called then, in my high school. So we had about 6 children with profound hearing loss in the unit, and we were able to volunteer and join with my peers in the unit, and it was a really rewarding experience to work and have friendships with those kids. And I also had a classmate with a severe stutter. But what I noticed at a very early age was that some inequities started to open up for my peers with these conditions in terms of social and educational opportunities. And I was passionate about that. And I was passionate about thinking, why do people have these conditions and what could be done about it? I was quite fortunate actually to go to Tassie because, to be born in Tassie, because Tassie didn't have a program for speech pathology at the time, but the Department of Education would give 2 fellowships each year to individuals, and myself and my dear friend Daniela Rosignol went off as little 17-year-olds up to UQ to take part in the speech pathology program up there. And what a fantastic decision we had made, both to go to UQ because they had an excellent culture of clinical research. They were really a collegial group of individuals, very encouraging and giving opportunities. I took every opportunity they offered. So there was a dual degree in audiology and speech path at the time. So I took that opportunity. And there was also this great honours program. And what fantastic honour supervisors I had in Louise Hickson and Linda Worrell here. They gave me a lot of autonomy, but very appropriately so, and were just really fun and inspiring research leaders. And that was it. I was hooked from that day on. Someone in the department then said to me, oh, you should apply for one of these APAs, a PhD stipend. And I said, well, actually, I'm bonded to go back and work as a clinician in Tassie because the government have supported me. And they said, well, just apply. You could always sort of postpone it and put it off for a bit. Well, 16 years later, after I toddled into this building with my little brother, I was working back in the very same building in the Department of Education. And that was a really important year because I learned that I really liked working in special education, but was more interested and drawn to children who had broader and complex presentations. And I could see that our symptom-based management worked for some individuals, but not others. And surely with the different etiologies that these children must have that we really knew very little about at that time, you could better target your treatment. Sort of one symptom based approach shouldn't fit all kids. And so that was frustrating to me, wondering about etiology. But there was limited research opportunity in that very clinical role, and there wasn't a lot of multidisciplinary work, and I sort of missed families because we were working mainly with children and teachers. So that was a really seminal year for me, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do because I couldn't see myself staying, and I nearly left speech pathology that year. My parents will tell you I actually got quite depressed. And then this wonderful clinical champion really did help me, wonderful Dr. Kelly Weir, who was at that time at Royal Children's Hospital in Queensland. Kelly reached out and she said, actually, Ange, I'm going to take a secondment and I wonder if you'd like to do a backfill position for me. She'd been one of my clinical educators. A fantastic opportunity. So I did. I went up to Queensland. The APA had been awarded at that time, but I wasn't ready to take that up yet. I wanted a little bit more clinical work. But eventually I did come around to a PhD, and with Professor Liz Ward as my supervisor at UQ, and collecting data in a clinically driven PhD across both the Royal Kids and the Mater Kids as they were then in Brisbane. And I just had the most fantastic time. Such supportive clinicians who shared the vision of needing more evidence, and really supportive academics also at UQ, who gave so many opportunities. And I also sought opportunities at UQ in other RA roles in different schools. But at the end of my PhD, I was tapped on the shoulder again. And you might like to think about there's a postdoc role in London, and I think it would actually fit what you're into. So I applied. It was a harrowing week-long interview in London. I lost 3 kilograms during that week. It was so stressful for me. But fantastically, I was so fortunate to get the job under the tutelage of this fantastic scientist, Professor Farineh Baba-Kadem, who also worked closely with Simon Fisher at that time at University College London, Institute of Child Health in Great Ormond Street in London. And Farineh and Simon, together with their other colleagues, had identified that it was mutations or variants in the FOXP2 gene that explained a severe speech disorder in half the members of this very large 3-generational family. So that was really exciting. The first gene for speech in the absence of intellectual disability. And I was also lucky at that time to work not only in genetics or phenotyping for genetics, but also learned brain imaging acquisition and analysis techniques under the tutelage of Alan Connolly, who at that time was head of the Wellcome Trust Centre for Neuroimaging in the UK, and who fortuitously moved to Melbourne many years later, just as I was also moving to Melbourne. So I was lucky with that. But what these people gave me, as others have said today as well about their mentors, was such generosity of time, intellect, and also just so humble. It was a big deal, that the identification of that gene, and what a great time to be in that team. We even got to meet the Queen, and they were always being wheeled off to important events, and they gave me a place at the table and allowed me to have those opportunities, riding on their fabulous coattails. I also met this wonderful neuroscientist, Professor Kathryn Refshauge, and she taught me the importance of peer mentoring and peer relationships and supports. She and I were given wonderful opportunities. We had a conjoint role really in my postdoc at UCL. We had to support others in their research careers at a children's neuro rehab centre. So we had to work out, how do we do this leadership thing and how do we support others quite early out of our PhDs? And we're given just so many great opportunities. But I was missing that one-on-one sort of clinical work, and also missed teaching and mentoring individuals in speech pathology as well. And I also thought maybe there could be more genes for speech. So I was interested to think about a research program focused on that area. And I applied for an NHMRC postdoc fellowship and was fortunate to get that in the mid-2000s. And I've been at this great campus ever since, because we've got research clinical and academic components. And a big shout out to Linda Dennehy and Gary Rance at the School of Health Sciences, because they also support me having that continual role, being able to teach the next generation in the speech department at Uni Melbourne. But really, when I came back to Australia, there was one person I wanted to work with. I didn't know how great the children's campus was at that time. I just had my eyes set on this fantastic lady, Professor Sheena Riley, a leading international speech pathologist, and just a really generous and inspiring person. And it was just the best move I ever made, and I've got so much to thank Sheena for. I also met up with this other wonderful person, Professor Ingrid Scheffer, and Ingrid, of course, with her great work understanding the genetic etiology of epilepsy. Kathy gave her the lovely introduction earlier. And both of these individuals, just really inspiring leaders, again, generosity, sharing successes in difficult times, giving me a place at the table. And I learned best by immersive learning. So I was so grateful for those individuals for including me in each step of the way. And they really supported my independence. I wasn't doing work for them. They've always really supported me. And other of my core mentors continue to support me as well. And we all collaborate together, which is just a dream come true, really. I've mentioned families a few times throughout the talk, and that I'd missed working with families at various times. And I just think it's the most fantastic time in science, because consumers really have a voice. And I'm so grateful to work for all of these great foundations. I also thought life wasn't complex enough, and I introduced these young people into my life. So I do have 2 children, and it's really tough. It was really tough when they were young. They're 9 and 11 years of age now, so a bit older than here. But you do sort of live a split life, doing puzzles at 6 a.m. with the kids and then sharing a meeting at 9. But of course, as Gavin and others have said, you wouldn't change it for the world. And it's fantastic there are more support schemes available for families. But coming 39 years forward again from my first exposure to speech therapy at age 6, why do people have communication problems? What can we do about it? Thanks to the support of my mentors and another clinical champion at my children's campus, we now have a speech genetics clinic at the Royal Kids Hospital in Victoria, and many thanks to the Children's Hospital Foundation who support our clinic, and also to Professor David Amor, who co-leads that clinic with me, and for whom I really couldn't do this work without David. And do you remember the name of the speech pathologist that treated my brother? It was Lynn Brooks, and Lynn is going to retire this year. So what a shame for my profession. But I have to say, Lynn just sent us the most fabulous referral of a young man. She saw it was a striking speech condition, and he has a novel gene, a gene that hasn't been written up in the literature, and a variant in that gene that explains his speech disorder. So she continues to be a fab speech pathologist, and it's so lovely to see that relationship come full circle, I think. Summary and advice, as everyone said, there will be lots of failures and rejections. And I think the only times they keep me down is if I let my ego get in the way, or if there's been Machiavellian behaviour. There are politics, things happen, but as others have said today, you just keep your vision and keep going forward and find paths around. You need to follow your passion, try all the different mixes. Are you more clinical? Are you more research, teaching? But for me, it's really finding those people who share your vision. I did it intuitively. I found all of these amazing people, but I probably would have wasted less time if I thought about that rather than intuitively doing it. And if I just didn't waste a lot of energy sometimes on collaborations that perhaps weren't going to move forward. And you can have a family. It's not easy, but you just have to keep adapting and trying to make it work. And the best part of our jobs is, of course, supporting next generation. And I've really loved seeing my team become independent, but here we can see my current team. And so I look forward to seeing them with their success in the future. Thank you.
Angela, thank you so much. Truly paradigm shifting work, truly groundbreaking. Thank you for that. And lots of fantastic tips. I'm looking at the questions in the Slido, and as you will note, we're just running a little bit behind, so we'll get to all the questions at the end. But thank you, Ange, very impressive work. Now I'm very pleased to introduce Gráinne O'Loughlin, who's the CEO of Karitani, and she's been there since 2014. She has more than 30 years experience in public health and community service in the UK and Australia. She too commenced her career as a speech pathologist and has held many senior executive roles. What's really important is that she was appointed the inaugural conjoint Professor of Allied Health in New South Wales between the University of Sydney and St Vincent's Hospital in 2013. So that's with me. So I've worked with Gráinne since then. But she has a strong focus on leading better value healthcare through scaling evidence-based interventions so that all children get the best possible start in life. To this end, she's led many state and federal initiatives, including virtual care and perinatal infant mental health programs. So what she's talking about today is the path to building an invincible clinician research workforce. And I thought it would be so interesting to hear from Gráinne from all the opportunities she's made for emerging clinician researchers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy, for that introduction. And look, can I just say how inspired I was listening to all the presentations this afternoon. As a speech pathologist, particularly Angela, I've heard names from my career in the early 90s that I didn't think I'd hear again for such a while. I think what many of the presenters today shared in common was every step of the way helps. And whilst I didn't go on to be to have a career as a researcher, I certainly had a hybrid role in the 1990s where I was a clinician researcher myself. I actually chose the management pathway, but part of that pathway was about becoming an enabler or a facilitator for clinicians who are passionate about research, and really how you make sure that there's opportunities within the workplace. Kathy, as you've alluded to, certainly passionate about creating formal conjoint appointments between the hospital setting and academia and university, but also making the culture within the organisation one where you're focused on outcomes and evidence-based models of care, so that every clinician who's delivering care actually connects it to efficacy and outcomes, and that can be in quality cycles, connecting with researchers, doing a bit of data collection, anywhere right up that spectrum to making that leap to working in the academic system itself. So I think that's been a big challenge for us. Often the thing I hear from clinicians the most is no time. And I bet if we ask each of the researchers today who've shared the story, all of you will speak about the need to juggle work and life balances and unusual research hours. I have to say I see that in passionate clinicians and passionate managers. So the health system itself is not a great enabler for doing all the great work within paid time. And I think we know that. But I might just, after that little intro, Kathy, leave us if there are any particular questions that come up on the Slido. And also, I know Nadine's going to chat as well. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Gráinne. I'm not sure that people would understand the power of the changes that you've implemented wherever you're the CEO. So I'll force you to talk about that a bit more in the questions. But sure. Now I'm delighted to introduce Professor Nadine Foster, who's a physiotherapist a lifetime fellow of the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy in the UK and was previously the National Institute for Health Research Senior Investigator and NIHR Research Professor in the UK. In 2020, I'm very pleased to say that she moved from Keele University in the UK to Queensland to take up the role of Professor and Director of the STARS Research and Education Alliance between the University of Queensland and Metro North Health in Queensland. So STARS is the Surgical Treatment and Rehab Service, which is the newest public hospital in Brisbane. She's a prolific researcher and has attracted truly huge research funding from key grant agencies in Australia, UK and USA. So maybe we need some tips there. But I just give one important example of what she's done as an example, her work on stratified primary care for patients with musculoskeletal pain. So what I asked Nadine to talk about was opportunities in the UK compared with her observations in Australia, clinician-scientist opportunities. Thank you, Nadine.
Thanks, Kathryn. Just to check, can you hear me okay and see the slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And this is going to be a slightly different take. I'm really going to just use the opportunity of me recently arriving from the UK to showcase an example of what I would consider a bit of a best practice international example of really supporting the clinical research careers of our non-medical allied health professions. I myself, just so you know, got the research bug very early in my career. I was incredibly lucky to have a clinical research project experience as part of my 4-year honours physiotherapy course. Completely got the research bug and knew that I wanted to do more with that, and then proceeded to do a PhD early in my career, and then have since done a lot of clinical-based research over my career. Although I'm now based at the University of Queensland and STARS Hospital, I thought what would be really useful in the context of this presentation is just tell you a little bit about where we were at in the UK over the last 15 years with this agenda. And really what we were seeing is what you've all heard already from many clinicians trying to forge a path to be a clinical academic. The real lack of career structure, the need for a very highly motivated individual and a bit of the right place, right time luck in the mix. One-off posts created around individuals with one or more posts with kind of hybrid, unstable models of employment, short-term and vulnerable funding. In fact, in our disciplines, many clinicians who were trying to be researchers talked about often having to step back in their career to make the change that they wanted, and a real lack of a clear clinical academic pathway. And others will have heard me say before, I think one of the challenges for us is that we don't actually have a pathway. And I've just put those 3 pictures up to explain what I mean. On the left, you have a very clear pathway. You can see ahead. You can see that there will be bumps in the road, but you can see the next step and the next step. We don't even really have this even winding pathway where sometimes you really can't see the corners, you can't quite see over that horizon. It's still a pathway and you can sort of see where you're going. I think where we're at really, and where certainly we were 15 years ago in the UK, is a picture more like this on the right, which is a sort of series of disconnected islands with people standing on those islands. You can see they're there, but you're not quite sure how they got there. And crucially, you can't see how you can get there yourself. And that for me is the difference between a pathway and a series of disconnected opportunities. For me, our research career structure needs to look like a strong pyramid. And that means you need lots of people coming in at the bottom, whether they be eager early graduates or qualifying master's programs, into PhDs, into postdoc careers, into middle research leadership careers, in order to have the research leadership at the top of that pyramid. Certainly when we looked at this in the UK over many years, even with the example that I'm going to share with you from the Health Education England and NIHR, structuring and supporting careers, even with that, we still do not have a pyramid after 15 years in the UK. We have lots of people now coming in at the bottom, getting early tastes of research and doing PhDs, but we have a huge deficit in people pulling that through into the postdoc years and staying with it in clinical research. So there's no doubt in any of our minds that these careers need very careful and sustained support, something that's bigger and more systematic than a series of motivated individuals. So very briefly, in the UK, this problem was identified more than 15 years ago. It was very much promoted through a document called the Finch Report that came out in 2007. That report was focused on reforming nursing careers, but allied health professionals were invited to consider the applicability of the recommendations to their professions. Essentially, what this proposed was a new training path with a much more systematic and coordinated approach to research training, with a focus on clinical academic careers, i.e. those that combine research and clinical practice, but with career flexibility. And inbuilt into those recommendations was a national system of mentoring and peer support. And I'm going to pull through in the interest of time right through to the current landscape, 15 years later, where there now has been over 10 years of maturation of a systematic approach to supporting these careers through HEA's Health Education England and the NIHR, the National Institute for Health Research, and their very specific and ring-fenced programme of funding called the ICA programme, Integrated Clinical Academic Programme. And I've put that link also into the Slido chat so you can click on it for more information. Where we are now is that this scheme offers 5 awards, from early internships and tasters, if you like, for clinicians into research, into a structured pre-doctoral programme in their PPF award, a clinical doctoral research fellowship, 2 postdoctoral awards, the clinical lecturer and the senior clinical lecturer, and they also now offer some bridging awards for people as they hop around these islands trying to find the next step and get some support for that next step. Crucially, they also have, through that national mentoring scheme, a series of advocates and mentors that are supporting these individuals holding these awards. And that's been, I think, a crucial source of support, as well as example contracts, for example, for host organisations. Universities can host these individuals, and the health system, the NHS, and health organisations can host these. So flexibility is key. Very briefly, this is what it looks like. This is the NIHR Academy. So this is the whole structure under the NIHR in the UK to support research careers. And they have fellowships for all. They have fellowships for doctors and dentists alone, fellowships for all other healthcare professionals. And it's these ones that I've boxed in yellow that are particularly suitable for allied health professions. So whether you're a physiotherapist or a speech pathologist, you are able to apply for one of these green fellowships, which are open to everyone. And they could also include medics, they could include statisticians, health economists, or you could go for this particular ICA scheme, which is in pink, which is specifically and only for allied health professions. And they're from the left-hand side, the pre-doc, right through to that senior clinical lectureship. So a lot of the staff that I supported in the UK were funded through this system, and I myself, my career was heavily funded by the NIHR. I was a physiotherapist that held one of their green research professorships, for example, on this slide. And they've now added that internship, even just realizing that they need even just to offer these opportunities for people to take those first steps into salaried opportunities for early research, even before they develop a plan to do a pre-doctoral fellowship. So lots of focus on that first step to pull through people's interest into research activity. These awards are all about combining clinical research and research leadership with clinical practice. It's all about people not having to leave clinical practice to stay and do the clinically based research that they're passionate about. And this is my last slide. Of course, these opportunities are amazing. They're highly competitive. So for example, any one award, let's pick the Clinical Doctoral Research Fellowship. I used to chair that panel. Nationally, we'd get around 80 or 90 applications a year, and we might offer about 20 of those. So that's not a bad hit rate, but it is incredibly competitive. So these awards go to the very best applicants who have the best projects and the best support around them. And it doesn't, even that systematic approach doesn't stop all the usual things that we need. In the top left, a heavy degree of tenacity to get through the hard times in some of these opportunities. Working with good people, not only good people because they're excellent in their research field, but also because they really want to help you as an individual. On the far right, of course, even with these awards, people need to work really hard. They need to write papers, they need to write grants, they need to look for all of those other opportunities to support their clinical research. On the bottom left, that national mentorship scheme that I mentioned, I was the lead NIHR physiotherapy advocate for 5 years, doing a lot of spotting where people need advice, where people need just connecting up nationally with other experts in the field who can help polish their ideas and help make their research stronger. And then finally, of course, the whole issue of time management, incredibly difficult as a clinical academic, the pressing issue of time management, but also even just the time to develop these applications. Seeing that develop in the UK, most people are planning these applications a year in advance and getting support to do that. I've early days here in Australia, of course, realising that Australia is perhaps at an earlier stage of this type of national approach to structured support for careers like this. But super keen, especially in my role as a conjunct professor here in STARS, to work out how we can improve the opportunities to develop clinical academic allied health professionals. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nadine. And it gives us plenty of ideas about how to take it forward in Australia. I noticed in the chat, in the Slido, that someone said it's great to hear that there's lots of opportunities now. I'm sorry if I gave the wrong impression. There are some opportunities, but I think it's time that we can make more. And if we could take it ourselves so that we create systematic opportunities, not just hope randomly that you find someone who gives you an opportunity. But I think it's time to do that. And I think we've had lots of fabulous, helpful hints about tenacity and resilience, about just start, don't wait for it to be perfect, having supportive environments and things. And I wonder if we just go back to Gronya. Most of the things in the chat are comments, but I will come back to a couple. But I'd like to go back to Gronya to ask you, Gronya, to talk a little bit more about providing that supportive environment. You actually do it, don't work in it, you create it. So do you want to talk about that to give people ideas that they can take back as the manager or to their managers?
Yes, certainly at St Vincent's where I used to work, and also now more so in Karitani, as I say, we created that structure of having conjoint appointments, or clinical academic appointments, but right the way through each service system and each department, we identified clinicians who had a leaning or a penchant for doing rigorous data collection, working on outcomes, working on projects. And we set up a research committee led by the academic team, but we invited all the clinicians who had an interest or a passion to be connected to the research team so that they could hear what the research program was and any ideas of interest. We also advertised and promoted the research that was being undertaken within the organisation. We certainly found that sometimes it can be a bit invisible, the researchers over one end of the building and the clinicians in another. So we really integrated them physically, co-located researchers in the units around, doing ward rounds and immersing themselves and being very visible. I myself, I think someone alluded to mentoring. So mentoring externally for budding academics through the Serendis mentoring program, and also the Sydney University mentoring program as well that was run, Kathy, you may recall. So I think workforce capacity building was certainly big for me, creating a culture of research and academia. Building in quarantined time. So in the Allied Health Award, I think Victoria mentioned it, there are actually positions now that are created that you can be a senior clinician who specialises, you can have more of an academic leaning, or you can take a managerial career path. And so there are incentives there to build it in. But it does take management, and it needs to be at every layer of management. It needs to be talked about, it needs to be on meeting agendas, and it needs to have a governance framework that supports academic research projects from clinical outcomes and development upwards. So I guess you find passionate individuals and you make sure you identify them and foster them through your networks. Thanks, Kathy.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gráinne. And I just know Gráinne put that into PDs in Karitani and stimulated people to engage even in scholarly work, looking at their own clinical data to improve what they're doing, just exactly as Bernie said she did, but without any help. Andrew Davison has these are all really comments, but they're worth just pulling out and thinking about a bit. That I really like your point about hemorrhaging clinicians to management roles. They're also leadership roles, so they're important. But also the idea of leading as a clinician researcher rather than just publishing papers. Who would like to talk to that? Maybe Gavin, who mentioned it a bit. Maybe Bernie.
Yeah, sure. So like, yeah, didn't mean to be derogatory. They're obviously very important roles, but you know, change in practice is very difficult and it's very challenging. And so I think it helps to have. It's a relatively new field of research. This translation knowledge, translation implementation. So it's probably not what most young clinicians necessarily think of when they're thinking of research, but once you've been doing it for a while, then you realise how important it is when you know, you can see how many things, you know, you observe what's going on in clinical practice and how things you know, could be better, you know, if they did implement guidelines. And, you know, you don't have to be a researcher to look at, you know, stroke guidelines or spasticity guidelines or, you know, guidelines, whatever population you're working with, and just to do an audit and see, you know, if that is what's happening, you know, in your workplace. You know, it's not a bad way to, you know, kickstart your interest in research.
Ange, do you want to speak to that as well?
No, I think Gavin answered that beautifully, but I did notice there was a question to ask us how the role of a clinician researcher might have changed over time. So I wondered if that would be okay to talk to that.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, I think it's a great question because there wasn't even such a term. I don't know if Gavin agrees, but when I first started, it was more just that you were a clinician and then you might have liked research. And as Bernie nicely said, you just kept going step by step forwards. And I feel like the term clinician-scientist, as Ingrid prefers, or clinician researcher is really something that's just come about in the last few years in terms of on my radar anyway. So that's my response to that, but I don't know if Gavin had something further or others had something further to add there.
Yeah, I really had never really thought about it until more recent years, and well, I love my role and I would encourage others to do it, you know, and it does have challenges, but I suppose I thought, you know, in my younger days that, you know, clinicians in hospitals and researchers are in universities, and it's definitely changing, and there's definitely, you know, I'm surrounded by lots of people who are, you know, very keen to be embedded in healthcare networks and make sure that, you know, research findings are well translated and clinical practice does change.
Yeah, and in fact, when I started, people couldn't see the point of research in clinical work, and I come across that quite regularly still. Like, I'm a clinician, why would I want to know about research? And so this is just beautiful. Nadine, do you have anything to add to what Gavin and Ange said about that?
Only that it's only a losing researchers to clinical leadership roles if they don't want to do it themselves. I think actually we need many more managers and leaders in our health system who have research training. because that will, over time, also help those who want to be clinical academics. Because if our managers and leaders understand the world of research, then I am sure that's a very positive move for all of those who want to develop these joint clinical research roles. Certainly, again, drawing on experience in the UK, one of the barriers and solutions to opening up these careers is to have managers and leaders in a health system that understand these roles and crucially understand the benefits of clinically embedded research. So I would say it's only a problem if these individuals don't want to pursue that pathway and are forced into it in some way. Otherwise, I think it's great. You know, not everyone with a PhD needs to be a research leader, and we need lots of clinicians who do research and then move into management and leadership.
Absolutely. So as our final few questions, and as people come up with some more, we haven't addressed all of them, but a lot of them are comments, and it's things like clinician-scientist, clinician-researcher, and sort of tackled that. It's not a right word or wrong word, it's a preferred term. But I just would like to ask you, what was the best and worst advice you received? Why don't we start with Bernie?
Oops. Sorry, technology. Probably the best advice that I've received was I think I've given it out, is just to do it anyway. You know, I could think of, when I started, lots of reasons why I shouldn't do it, lots of barriers, lots of challenges. Certainly, if I looked at the evidence, it was right in front of me. Everyone excluded people who didn't speak English in pretty much every study I was reading. So the best advice was just to give it a go, and what have you got to lose, and just do it anyway. The worst advice I've received probably along the way was sort of grappling between perfect research and pragmatic research. And so along the earlier years, it was really about, you know, you can't do the study that way. You know, you need to have a lot more control. It can't be as broad as you want to do it, or as real world as you would like to do it, because it was really important to me to have really broad inclusive criteria for the work we were doing, because I wanted it to match clinical practice. And so, yeah, that was happily some advice that I built some confidence around, not completely ignoring, but trying to really stay true to keeping it reflective of my patient cohort. So.
Fabulous, thanks. And Janine, would you like to add something to what Bernie said?
Sure, I'd love to. So, I mean, I would also agree. I keep getting the advice to just do it, which I think is great. But also some great advice I've received is to firstly focus on a topic, or choose the topic that excites you, because, you know, I think at this stage, I'm thinking about a PhD. It's not like, you know, a summer fling. It's a long-term committed relationship for at least 3 years. So you really do have to love it. But also, I think some other advice is, it's like going on 3 things now, is to choose a topic that is going to be, or choose mentors that really work with you well, and choose a topic that is supported within the health service and amongst the academic team that I'll be working with. Because I think that will hopefully make the process of collecting data and having support from the people that I need support, as in managers and academics and funding, a lot easier. Worst advice, I'm not sure that I've received bad advice, so maybe that's because I haven't been doing it long enough. Yeah, I can't think of anything at the moment about that. Sorry.
Well, I'm delighted you've had no worst advice. I do notice Nadine wanted to jump in and add a comment, and I'm sorry I missed that.
It's fine, Kathryn. It was to the earlier comment about managers. Yep.
Go for it. Go for it, Nadine. Add to it.
Kathy, sorry, I've already commented on that. It was to the previous question.
Yeah, go for it though. Add to the previous question. That's fine.
About
We
bad
can go
advice?
backwards.
About bad advice?
Yeah, anything.
Goodness.
No, to the previous question you wanted to answer. That's fine.
Oh, no, I did. I was just making the point about really encouraging managers to have research training. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Got it.
It's okay.
Now everyone's heard you twice, so that's good. I do want to just quickly ask the elephant in the room question. Has this taken additional time? Have you had to work extra hours to get there? And how did that feel? Was that worth it? So maybe start with Gavin. And
additional hours. And so I suppose, Janine's point about, finding something you're passionate about, because if you're passionate about your topic, it doesn't seem to be as hard work as what it is. But I mean, you're definitely going to be working nights and weekends. And but if that's your interest, it's less. But I suppose it resonated with me, and for my staff or colleagues who are interested, I'll get them involved in research projects before they're enrolled themselves, just so they can dip their toe in the water and get a feel for what it's like and what the commitment is and how it works, and work out if it's for them or not. So yeah, you need to definitely go in with your eyes open, because it is a lot of work.
Fantastic. Well, we're at time. There's still comments in the chat. This has been recorded, and so that people can access it later. Steve, I'm not sure how they access it, but yes, people, if they can access it, and if others can. And I noticed that it's been tweeted about already. But I think that there's lots and lots of ideas there. There's common themes about how to do it, but still in allied health, it's about self-generated and self-motivated and a lot of energy yourself to create opportunities. But yes, you absolutely need a supportive environment. And our team of panelists and organisers and speakers are pretty keen to take this further, and judging by the comments and the talks and the level of interest, it seems like there is support for us to do that. So it's taken, I don't know, a few centuries to get a few opportunities for clinician researchers, but maybe by next year we'll have a whole lot more opportunities and maybe a pathway. We'll just get Nadine onto that and sort it out. So thank you everyone for coming. I also give another shout out to Anne-Marie Boxall, because she's here. I was hoping to show her, because everyone needs to meet Anne-Marie. She's a bundle of energy, our first full-time federal Chief Allied Health Officer. Andrew Davison is here, also New South Wales Chief Allied Health Officer. And of course, thank you, Ingrid. Most of all, thank you to all our panelists and speakers. It's fantastic to see that journey and the similarities. It's wonderful, though, to see that for Janine, some opportunities are being created. So at the early stages, and with Bernie, creating their own opportunities, but they're there. Whereas Gavin and Ange were much more having to create their own, because the term didn't even exist. And we have managers like Gronya and leaders like Nadine forging those pathways for us. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll be back again in a year to build on this, and hopefully we'll take it to a new level. So thank you. Bye.